LeBron James has finally addressed the growing buzz surrounding Ben Simmons and the possibility of the former Sixers star making his way back to Philadelphia. Ever since LeBron stunned the league by signing with the Sixers, speculation about Simmons returning has been everywhere. And now, LeBron's move has fans looking at the situation from a completely different angle. People are beginning to ask the obvious question: does LeBron actually want Simmons on this roster, or is this all just coincidence? Let's break down what really happened. LeBron James didn't return to the Lakers. He didn't go back to Cleveland for some storybook finale. Instead, he chose Philadelphia, and the decision sent shockwaves throughout the league. Reactions came almost immediately, and some of the biggest names had plenty to say. Caitlin Clark found out about the news in real time and didn't hold back. Her first response was simple: "No way, wow." She also said she'd be watching more 76ers games now that LeBron was in Philadelphia. That is exactly the kind of instant attention the Sixers wanted, and they got it. But not everyone reacted with excitement. Gilbert Arenas, who has never been shy about speaking his mind, made it clear that he wasn't exactly thrilled about the decision. He joked that Savannah couldn't have approved it and suggested that nobody would willingly choose Philadelphia. It was clearly delivered as a joke, but it also captured how unexpected LeBron's decision felt to a lot of NBA fans. Then there's Jaylen Brown, who joined Philadelphia earlier this summer after being traded from Boston. His reaction was short and direct. He posted the team's new hashtag and kept things moving. No long statement, no detailed breakdown, just a simple sign that he was ready for what comes next. And then there was Anthony Simmons, who had a completely different reaction. He described waking up, seeing the headline, and immediately thinking the whole thing was crazy. He even had to double-check the news before realizing LeBron really was heading to Philly. 4 players, 4 completely different reactions, all connected to the same massive development. But the part of this story involving Ben Simmons goes beyond simple fan speculation. Simmons himself has already made it clear that a return to Philadelphia is something he would consider. In a June interview with Men's Health, he said, "Maybe I'll go back to Philly," while also mentioning Miami because of his respect for Eric Spoelstra, the Heat organization, and its culture. That made the timing of LeBron's arrival especially interesting. Simmons didn't play in the NBA at all during the 2025-26 season, and he is now preparing for a possible return for the 2026-27 campaign. So when the Sixers suddenly added LeBron to a roster already loaded with talent, the idea of Simmons returning started to look a little less far-fetched. Here's what makes the situation different from your typical reunion rumor. LeBron and Simmons have a connection that goes back years. Early in Simmons' career, LeBron followed his development closely. They shared an agent and trained together during off-seasons. So when Philadelphia became a realistic destination for LeBron, the idea of Simmons potentially returning wasn't completely random. There was already a relationship between the two players long before this current situation developed. And when you look at the roster, the fit becomes even more interesting. The Sixers didn't simply make a few minor adjustments this offseason. They reshaped the team around Joel Embiid, Tyrese Maxey, Jaylen Brown, VJ Edgecombe, and now LeBron James. That is already an extremely talented group. The supporting cast also includes players such as Dean Wade and Anthony Simmons, giving Philadelphia even more scoring and depth. That's why this new-look Sixers roster is being viewed as a legitimate championship contender. But there is still an obvious question surrounding the front court. Philadelphia needs enough reliable depth behind Joel Embiid, especially if injuries become an issue. And that is where Ben Simmons could potentially become an intriguing option if he is healthy and fully committed to returning. A minimum-level contract could make sense financially, especially after Philadelphia added LeBron on a veteran minimum deal. But that doesn't mean a Simmons signing is guaranteed, or even that the Sixers are currently committed to making it happen. It simply means the basketball logic is easier to understand than it was before LeBron arrived. So this story isn't really about LeBron publicly demanding that Philadelphia bring Simmons back. There's no confirmed report that James has made that request. Instead, LeBron's arrival has changed the context around a possibility that Simmons himself already acknowledged. His desire to return, Philadelphia's new roster, and the connection between Simmons and LeBron have all made the idea worth discussing. A door that once looked completely closed suddenly doesn't seem quite as locked. To understand why that door was ever closed in the first place, and why Philadelphia might even consider opening it again, you have to go back to a draft class, a shared agent, and a relationship that started long before LeBron ever became part of the Sixers' plans. Because this isn't simply two players being connected by a headline. The story stretches back nearly a decade. Ben Simmons entered the NBA as the #1 overall pick in the 2016 NBA draft, selected by Philadelphia after his lone season at LSU. A foot injury kept him off the court during what would have been his first NBA season, but when he finally debuted in 2017-18, he made an immediate impact and won Rookie of the Year. From there, everything seemed to point towards superstardom. Simmons became a 3-time All-Star, earned 2 All-Defensive First-Team selections, and finished as the runner-up for Defensive Player of the Year during his final full season with Philadelphia. At that point, he looked like one of the franchise's foundational pieces. And now, with LeBron James entering the picture, that story may not be finished after all. Before the back problems and injuries derailed his development, Ben Simmons was not the player some people now reduce him to, not even close. He won Rookie of the Year during the 2017-18 season. From there, he went on to make 3 straight All-Star appearances, and even earned an All-NBA third-team selection along the way. This wasn't empty hype with nothing to show for it. Simmons was a legitimate young star rising quickly, and he was still only entering his mid-20s. Philadelphia saw that potential too, and the organization didn't hesitate to invest in him. Before Simmons even finished his rookie contract, the Sixers locked him into a massive 5-year max extension worth more than $170 million. At the time, general manager Elton Brand described him as one of the league's most dynamic young players, and made it clear that the organization expected him to develop into a franchise leader. The belief wasn't one-sided either. Simmons openly talked about improving his game, becoming more efficient, and continuing to develop in every area. That was also around the time his connection with LeBron began to grow stronger. Both players were represented by Rich Paul and Clutch Sports, the same agency that represents Tyrese Maxey, who is now one of the key pieces of Philadelphia's current roster. LeBron, already a multiple-time champion, wasn't simply watching Simmons from a distance, he was involved. The two trained together during the offseason, and LeBron paid close attention to Simmons' development, like a veteran who recognized serious potential in a young player. But that relationship with Clutch didn't remain consistent forever. Simmons eventually left the agency and spent a period represented elsewhere, and that stretch overlapped with some of the most difficult chapters of his career. That included his eventual trade to Brooklyn and the years that followed as he moved through different situations while trying to rebuild his rhythm and confidence. Now, this is where the story gets interesting again. Simmons is once again represented by Clutch Sports and Rich Paul, putting him back in the same professional circle as LeBron. Same agency, same network, and potentially many of the same conversations happening behind the scenes. And that matters because decisions like signing a minimum contract don't happen in complete isolation. Players, agents, teams, and executives are all part of a much bigger network. When Simmons spoke about the Sixers' new roster on his podcast, he didn't exactly hide his interest. He compared the group to the 2012 Lakers, the famous roster built around Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, Steve Nash, Dwight Howard, and Pau Gasol, that entered the season with enormous expectations, but ultimately failed to make a deep playoff run. Simmons, however, pointed out an important difference. He described playing alongside LeBron in Philadelphia as one of the most exciting basketball situations available, and suggested that the current Sixers roster could have more working in its favor than that Lakers team did.
That doesn't sound like someone completely detached from the possibility. It sounds like someone at least considering what it could look like. And then there's Rich Paul, who added even more fuel to the conversation. On another podcast appearance, he made the case that Simmons still has significant value in today's NBA. He even argued that, in the right situation, Simmons could command as much as $30 million per year, particularly if he found a role that allowed him to maximize what he does well. For a team like Philadelphia, which needs additional front court support behind Joel Embiid, that possibility becomes even more interesting. Think about what that means. Simmons' own agent, who also represents LeBron, is publicly arguing that his client still has plenty to offer at the NBA level. This isn't simply a random rumor appearing on social media. It's coming from someone directly connected to both sides of the situation. So when people start asking how LeBron feels about Simmons potentially joining the Sixers, the answer can't be reduced to one quick reaction. It starts with a relationship that has existed for years, a shared agency connection, and a network that has once again placed both players in the same basketball environment. LeBron didn't have to create a connection with Simmons after arriving in Philadelphia. That connection was already there. But you can't seriously discuss Simmons returning to the Sixers without confronting what happened the first time around, because his departure from Philadelphia was anything but smooth. It was messy, public, and impossible to forget. That's why any talk of bringing Simmons back doesn't just create excitement, it also brings a lot of old concerns rushing back. This is where the entire story changes. The goodwill Simmons had built as a rising star in Philadelphia took a major hit during the 2021 postseason. The Sixers entered that playoff run with legitimate championship expectations. Joel Embiid was playing at an MVP level, Simmons was coming off an elite defensive season, and Philadelphia had positioned itself as one of the strongest teams in the Eastern Conference. Then everything unraveled against the Atlanta Hawks. That series exposed Simmons' biggest offensive weakness, his reluctance to shoot, and it quickly became the defining storyline. The moment everyone remembers came late in Game 7, when Simmons passed up an open dunk instead of attacking the basket. He ultimately passed the ball, and the play became a lasting symbol of Philadelphia's collapse. The Sixers lost the series, and Simmons absorbed much of the criticism that followed. What happened next only made the situation more complicated. This wasn't a quiet offseason where both sides simply worked toward repairing the relationship. Simmons requested a trade, and when a deal didn't happen immediately, he stayed away from the team. He missed training camp and media obligations, and for a significant portion of the 2021-22 season, he remained on the roster without actually playing.
As the situation became more public and increasingly tense, there was a point when it appeared the relationship might finally be repaired. Philadelphia made a genuine effort to bring Simmons back into the fold. Simmons returned to the team and began taking steps toward rejoining his teammates. For a brief moment, it looked like both sides might actually find a way forward. He returned to practice and got on the court with teammates, while Doc Rivers said there were positive signs around the team. There was still uncertainty about whether Simmons would be ready for the season opener, but for that short window, a comeback in Philadelphia seemed possible. Then, almost immediately, everything fell apart again. During a practice session, Simmons was asked to participate in a defensive drill, but he refused. Rivers asked him again, Simmons still declined, and the coach eventually told him to leave the gym. Simmons walked out, and the consequences followed almost immediately. Philadelphia suspended him for 1 game for conduct detrimental to the team. From that point forward, the relationship was effectively beyond repair. Simmons never played another game for Philadelphia, and the Sixers eventually traded him to the Brooklyn Nets in February 2022. What began as the story of a young star who looked destined to become the face of the franchise had ended with one of the most complicated exits in recent Sixers history. The trade finally went through at the deadline that same season. Simmons was sent to the Brooklyn Nets in a blockbuster deal that brought James Harden to Philadelphia. On paper, it looked like the kind of move that could completely reset the situation for both teams. But in reality, things unfolded very differently. Before Simmons could even establish himself in Brooklyn, his body became the biggest obstacle. He was cleared to return at one point, but another setback stopped everything before he could truly get going. The player who once looked like one of the league's brightest young stars suddenly disappeared from the court for more than a year. Then came one of the strangest twists in the entire story. After his time in Brooklyn ended, Simmons was bought out and eventually signed with the Los Angeles Clippers, where he played alongside James Harden, the very same player he had originally been traded for. It's a strange full-circle moment that almost sounds too perfect to be real. LeBron even spoke about that stage of Simmons' career when the two faced each other after Simmons arrived in Los Angeles. When LeBron was asked about Simmons being with the Clippers, he kept his response calm and measured. He pointed out that Simmons was still adjusting, was relatively new to the system, and hadn't played enough games for anyone to make a fair judgment about how everything would work. He also expressed confidence that the coaching staff could put Simmons in situations where he could succeed. That might seem like a small comment, but it says something important about how LeBron viewed him. LeBron didn't speak about Simmons with harsh criticism or write him off. Instead, he sounded patient, almost like someone who remembered exactly how dominant Simmons could be and still believed that player might be somewhere inside him. But even that perspective can't erase what happened in Philadelphia. This wasn't a quiet breakup handled behind closed doors. It became public, tense, and extremely messy, and it left a lasting impression on the Sixers fanbase. That's exactly why Dwight Howard's post calling for Simmons to return didn't bring everyone together. It split the reaction down the middle. Some fans were excited by the possibility of seeing Simmons back in Philadelphia, while others immediately pushed back, bringing up old memories and memes to question why the organization would even consider giving him another chance. For many people in Philly, what happened in 2021 still feels unresolved. That frustration never completely disappeared, and that's what makes LeBron's role in this situation so fascinating. He isn't walking into a franchise with a clean slate and no history. He's entering a situation that still carries the weight of everything Simmons' departure left behind. Yet somehow, LeBron's presence could be the factor that changes how people view the possibility of a reunion. To understand how Simmons even found his way back into this conversation years later, you have to look at everything that happened after that suspension. Because his career didn't simply slow down. In many ways, it nearly disappeared beneath one setback after another. Once he arrived in Brooklyn, the challenge wasn't only adapting to a new team. His back problems followed him there and continued to affect his availability. He dealt with nerve issues, spinal problems, procedures, and lengthy rehabilitation periods that stretched across multiple seasons. And when he did get back on the floor, he wasn't the same player Philadelphia fans remembered. The explosiveness that once separated him from other players simply wasn't as consistent. He could still defend, facilitate, and create opportunities for teammates, but the production looked very different from his prime. During his best years in Philadelphia, Simmons was averaging roughly 16 points, 8 rebounds, and 8 assists per game. By the time he reached the Clippers, the decline was impossible to ignore. During the 2024-25 season, split between Brooklyn and Los Angeles, Simmons appeared in 51 games and averaged around 5 points, 5.6 assists, and 4.7 rebounds in roughly 22 minutes per game. Those numbers can still have value in a supporting role, but they're nowhere near the production people once expected from a former #1 overall pick and multiple-time All-Star. Then everything went quiet. The following season, Simmons didn't play at all, not one NBA minute. He spent the entire year as an unsigned free agent, while his name gradually disappeared from headlines, rumors, and serious team discussions. At that point, it would have been easy to assume the story was finished, another former top pick whose career had been derailed by injuries and never fully recovered. But now, with LeBron in Philadelphia and the conversation suddenly alive again, that ending doesn't seem quite as certain. Earlier this summer, Ben Simmons made one thing very clear. He doesn't believe his story is over. In an interview with Men's Health, he discussed the injury problems that pushed his career off course. More importantly, he made it clear that he wants to return to an NBA court, potentially as soon as this season. He didn't commit himself to one specific destination, but he did mention a couple of teams. And yes, Philadelphia was one of them. Miami was another option he spoke positively about, but that comment about Philly was the one that immediately caught people's attention. Before that interview, Simmons had largely disappeared from the free agent conversation. Afterward, reporters and insiders started looking more closely at the possibility, making calls and connecting the pieces behind the scenes. One analysis even described the idea of Simmons returning to Philadelphia after everything that happened as almost unbelievable. Yet at the same time, if Simmons is finally healthy and willing to accept a minimum contract, there is a legitimate basketball argument for the Sixers to consider it. That's the strange balance at the center of this entire situation. It sounds unbelievable, but when you actually look at the circumstances, it starts to make some sense. Let's be honest for a second. Nobody should be expecting Simmons to suddenly return as the all-star version of himself. Those expectations aren't realistic anymore. The more reasonable scenario would be a low-cost, versatile player who can defend multiple positions, move the basketball, create for others, and potentially give Joel Embiid some valuable rest without putting major pressure on Philadelphia's salary structure. That's not the kind of move that creates a superstar headline, but it could be a smart depth addition if Simmons is healthy enough to contribute. And what makes the situation even more interesting is who's been supporting the idea behind the scenes. While the NBA conversation around his future was growing, Simmons wasn't simply sitting around waiting for a phone call. He also spent part of the year investing in a fishing operation in South Florida, and that group eventually won a championship earlier this year. It might seem completely unrelated to basketball, but it shows that Simmons wasn't simply standing still while his NBA future remained uncertain. He was building something outside the game, while continuing to work toward the possibility of returning to it. By the time LeBron made his decision, Simmons was already appearing in conversations surrounding the Sixers, with Miami remaining part of the picture. But realistically, Philadelphia carries the most intrigue because of everything that happened there and because of the potential fit. LeBron didn't create this entire storyline from scratch. His arrival simply turned the volume up on something that had already been developing beneath the surface for weeks. So where does everything stand right now? Here's the important part. Ben Simmons has not signed with the Philadelphia 76ers. There has been no press conference, no jersey reveal, and no official announcement confirming a reunion. But at the same time, the possibility feels more realistic than it did just a few months ago. The Sixers have already made major moves this offseason. They brought in LeBron, they added Jaylen Brown, they secured Anthony Simmons early, they also added Kentavious Caldwell-Pope after a buyout, giving LeBron another familiar face from his past. Philadelphia has already done plenty of work to reshape the roster, and somehow, the Simmons move could still be the next piece. People around the situation have started framing it as a possible final calculated addition, with the front office seriously weighing whether Simmons could fill the last available roster spot. One insider even suggested that Simmons could become one of the summer's more surprising comeback stories, potentially returning on a one-year minimum contract.
Think about how different that sounds from where things stood only a few months ago. Back then, the idea probably would have been dismissed immediately. Now it's at least being discussed as a legitimate possibility. And there are three major reasons this conversation exists in the first place. First, LeBron is now in Philadelphia. Second, the Sixers have a need for additional depth behind Embiid. And third, Simmons himself wants another opportunity. That final piece matters. Simmons has openly discussed the possibility of rebuilding his image in the same city where his NBA story began. He would have the opportunity to return to the place where everything fell apart and potentially change how that chapter is remembered. For years, his name has remained attached to one playoff moment and the complicated exit that followed. So there is something undeniably compelling about the idea of rewriting that ending. Not somewhere else, but right there in Philadelphia. And this is where LeBron becomes such an important part of the conversation. He didn't sign with the Sixers simply to bring Simmons back. He came because he believes Philadelphia has a legitimate chance to compete for a championship. He has said as much, and his connection with Tyrese Maxey through Clutch Sports also played a role in the relationships surrounding the move. But once LeBron chose Philadelphia, the entire situation around the team changed. Suddenly, Simmons' camp had a more interesting reason to pursue another opportunity there. The front office had a more reasonable basketball argument for considering him, and the fans, who once seemed completely against the idea, at least had something new to think about. Dwight Howard clearly supports the possibility. His post wasn't random, it was him showing belief in a former teammate he still thinks can contribute. Rich Paul has also argued that Simmons still has meaningful value if he finds the right situation. And Simmons himself has made it clear that playing alongside LeBron on this version of the Sixers is a basketball situation he finds exciting. None of that guarantees a deal, though. NBA plans can change quickly. A medical concern could end the discussion.
Contract details could become an issue, or Philadelphia could simply decide that the risk isn't worth taking. That's the unpredictable part. But here's what we do know. The door that once appeared completely closed is no longer locked shut, and it's being held open by a connection that never fully disappeared, even while almost everything else around Simmons changed. Whatever happens next, one thing is already clear. LeBron didn't simply react to the idea of Simmons joining the Sixers. His decision to come to Philadelphia is the biggest reason this conversation is happening at all. If you've made it this far, then you already know this story is nowhere near finished. So hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with anyone who wants to understand what's really happening. Drop your thoughts in the comments too. Should the Sixers take a chance on Simmons, or should they leave the past exactly where it is? And stay tuned, because the next development in this situation could change the entire conversation. See you in the next one.